Now, without further ado, delegates and also participants, whether you're right here in Bali and also virtually, we're coming into the second session of the summit with the theme Accelerating Digital Transformation. The objective of the session is we'll examine how international standards can promote digital transformation across many industries, sectors, and cities with enable a circular, inclusive, and people-centric approach that empowers everyone, regardless of gender, age, ability, to benefit equally and equitably from new technologies. For this session, we already have our keynote speaker that will be sharing with you his presentation, Ian Opperman, Chief Data Scientist from New South Wales Government, in which Mr. Opperman himself will be leading for this session. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Ian Opperman.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Thank you very much for having me here today. It is a real pleasure. And I wanted to start this session by talking about why we should care about digital transformation. And it really comes down to the fact that the world is changing around us, and we know the world is changing around us. Industry is changing. The industries that we serve are changing. Electrification, digitization, personalization are changing every aspect of every industry around us. Who would have thought that just 10 years ago that the top 10 companies globally by market capitalization would not be oil companies or natural resources companies or even banks, but companies that develop software or companies that use data to drive real value. If you look at the top 10 companies globally, many of them, in fact, the list is dominated by companies like Microsoft, companies like Amazon, but also the electrification of the world around us we see in companies like Tesla in the top 10 companies in the world. And again, 10 years ago, if we were sitting here in 2012, we would not think the world would look like that. We also, of course, know that the world's population is changing. We will hit, for the first time ever, as human beings, 8 billion people on the planet this year. For the first time in our history, 8 billion people. And the projections, of course, keep going up until the end of the century. It's still subject to many assumptions, still subject to a whole lot of global shocks. But by 2030, when we're talking about the UN Sustainable Development Goals, we're talking another 500 million people, another 500 million people on the planet. 8.5 billion people population. And that's with no more land, no more water, no more natural resources. We have what we have, but an extra 500 million people on the planet who, of course, expect an improved quality of life compared to what we have today. Everybody continually expects that we improve our quality of life. And that's in the context of a changing climate. It's in the context of a changing environment. And of course, it does not stop there. By 2050, we're expecting 9.7 billion people, and by the end of the century, 11+ billion people. And if you think about a child who's born here in Indonesia today, almost every single one of those children will make it to the 22nd century, will make it to the end of this century. And that's how we get that extra 3 billion people on the planet. No more land, no more water, no more natural resources. We have what we have. And in the context of a changing climate, with this population that's growing, living longer, and living to be much older, we have a challenge of sustainable intensification. How can we keep increasing the population in an environment where we grow food, where we draw calories, where we draw sustenance from the planet is also changing? The challenge is sustainable intensification. Now, we talk about the UN Sustainable Development Goals, a great example of what we want the world to look like by 2030. We also know the goals have been in place since 2015. So we've had them, we've adopted them for 7 years, and we have about 7 years to go. And we also know that we run a very great risk of missing the goals for every single one of them. So what we are doing has to change. The way we are doing it has to change. The one resource that we have, which is in abundant supply, is, of course, renewable energy. But there's another resource that we have in abundant supply, and that's data or digital and technologies. And increasingly, how we respond to that challenge of sustainable intensification is going to need to draw on data, digital technologies, and also renewable energy. The way we think about an ageing population will need to change. The way we think about the circular economy will need to change. But to give you a sense of the scale of the challenge we're looking at, I looked at the cost of the moon landing project, the Apollo project in the US in the 60s. Very famous, transformed the way we as people think about our place in the solar system, think about our place in the universe. The cost of that program at the time was approximately $25 billion. In today's terms, that's about $250 billion, a very significant undertaking, but a relatively small proportion of the world's total production, the GDP of the US, the global production of the entire world. The estimate to get to net zero is measured in hundreds of trillions of dollars, 1,000 times more significant effort than the effort that helped us change the way we think about the world, change the way we think about ourselves. If we talk about something that we must do, if we talk about achieving sustainability, if we talk about gigaton decarbonisation, where we lock away carbon for geological timeframes, we need to invest a very, very serious amount in technology and in new ways of doing things. And if we do it the way we're doing things at the moment, we also run the risk of missing the target and expending a great deal of time, money, and effort doing it. So the case for change is not something which is important to do. Embracing the case for change is not something that's important for us to get serious about or to put more effort into. The case for change is essential, absolutely essential, if we are to meet the challenges of 2030, of 2050, and to meet the challenges for those children born today who are living through to the end of this century. So our session today is about transformation and innovation in transformation. And part of the reason for framing the conversation in such stark terms is to point out that innovation is not an optional thing. But innovation is hard, transformation is harder. And when we think about the need for the entire planet to transform, that's the biggest challenge that we have. That's a very difficult challenge. Different economies are, of course, at different stages of development. Different economies are at different levels of their own maturity in terms of use of data and digital, in use of AI, and in their own challenges locally and their own challenges in their own geographic context. But it's something that we really do need to collaborate on. And there are very few mechanisms that we genuinely collaborate through which have an impact on the real world. Standards is one of them. Standards is a genuinely global cooperative effort where we genuinely globally work together to produce practical, implementable, purposeful solutions that help us address the challenges not only of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, but of the challenges of an ageing society, the challenges of changing climate, the challenge of sustainable intensification. So today we're going to hear from some very distinguished speakers who are going to help us think through the challenges of the role of standards, how they promote digital transformation across many industries, and how we can work together to help deliver on the goals that we have stated, that we will deliver on, and to speak to the challenges that we have. We're joined today by Ilham Habibie, Mr. Ilham Habibie, who's the chair of the National ICT Council for Indonesia. We're joined by Vitasari Renee, who is the Deputy Director of Policy for Southeast Asia Women's World Banking. We're joined by Vail Diab, who is the chair of JTC1's SC42, which is artificial intelligence, and of course JTC1 is the collaborative activity between ISO and IEC. And we're joined by Arman Oryujaya, who is the Oryujand, who is the founding CEO at the Foundation for Armenian Science and Technology, who's joining us virtually. So I'd like to invite Mr. Ilham Habibi, who is the chair of the National ICT Council of Indonesia, to come and join me on the stage and to give a short opening statement. Please welcome Mr. Habibi. Are you ready for your opening statement?
Is it a statement or a presentation?
Presentation.
Presentation. Okay, I'm ready for the presentation. Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Ian Opperman, for the kind introduction. My name is Ilham Habibi. I'm the head of the National ICT Council, which is a government advisory agency. And our job is actually, one of them is to help the government for digital transformation. So this is really at the core of what we do. Can I have my slides? Okay, I think you have them just behind me. So just as an intro, can I have the first slide, please? Or the second, actually? Yeah, this is just to show what the structure looks like. I think the real interesting thing is that at the executive level, that's the part of the One Thickness organization that I'm leading, we are truly cross-sector, meaning we have participation from people from the government, of course, also people from the business sector like myself, from academia, and also from civil society organizations, including professional organizations like the Chamber of Commerce and industry. On the so-called steering committee level, it's all government headed by the president himself and a few ministers of his cabinet. The third slide shows you the task that we are supposed to perform. Can I have the next, please? First, just focus on the blue of the four tasks that you see in the upper part of the slide. So we are supposed to help formulating general policy, then resolve existing strategic issues, conduct national coordination that includes also national from central to regional governments. Indonesia is subdivided into many provinces and again subdivided into many sub-provinces, so-called regencies, and all of them, or not all, but some of them have their own regional ICT councils. And so we go with them or with regional-owned entities like companies, etc. Then you see on the lower part of the slide that, yes, indeed, the digital transformation is core of what we are supposed to help. Then on the next slide, very briefly, can I have the next? This is basically the President's directive regarding the National Digital Transformation Agenda. There's a lot of things that are written here, but I think main point regarding ICT is that we are supposed to integrate data, which is not an easy task to do. There's a lot of ego-sectoral behavior of national entities, ministries, and non-ministerial agencies. So because of historical development of ICT in our country, data centers and the management of those has been, by and large, actually by the government entities themselves, without looking at the integration of the data. And that is actually a big obstacle to really transform, because we have, contradicting data sometimes. It depends on the data definition and when they were updated, et cetera, et cetera. Then, of course, human resources is always at the core of transformation. I mean, this is a major challenge that I believe is, we've seen in many countries, not only Indonesia, that if you don't have the appropriate human resources, then it's very hard to do anything, including transformation. Then on the next slide, this is basically just to show you, this is basically what we are wanting to be looking like in 2045. That is when Indonesia defines itself as being already a developed country. What does it mean in economic terms? Right now, we just entered the reign of so-called lower middle income countries, which is around about $4,000 per capita per year. If we want to go into the high developed countries, we have to surpass $12,000 per capita per year. This is not a small undertaking. If you think about the amount of people that we have in Indonesia, right now 275 million people. I think in 2045 we will be well beyond 320 million. Can I have the next? This shows you very briefly how ready we really are. And there are three indexes that I refer to here, which are, I think, quite used in the world to show the status of any individual country. We talk about the Global Innovation Index, then Global Talent Competitive Index, and the UNDP Human Development Report. So you can see that Indonesia is sort of mid-range or mid to low. So we still have a lot of homework to do. And I believe personally the main point is, again, the main challenge is not so much technology or infrastructure. It's not easy, but the most difficult part is always the people. Get the people's education and understanding, experience right, and make them talk to one another and agree on things. Can I have the next? Then challenges and issues. Well, typical SWOT analysis, so you can see Indonesia is actually, demographically speaking, quite advantaged vis-a-vis other countries, because we have a very young population. You see 65% digital native, meaning younger than 40 years old, and that generation is, because they're digital native, they get things almost intuitively. They use it on a day-to-day basis, but actually at the same time, they are actually still lacking digital literacy, which is sort of like, at first you think this is contradictory, but it's not, because they are very apt to use digital technology for consumerism. But when it comes to productive issues, and that probably includes also standardization, because you want to use digital technology not only to consume, but you want to produce, you want to increase the competitiveness of your small, medium-sized industries, and we have a lot of those in Indonesia. 99% of all companies in Indonesia are small, medium-sized, and it is a particular challenge to get those companies in the millions. They deliver about 56, 57% of PDB, of GDP. So to get those millions and millions of Indonesians who are working in the small, medium-sized enterprise sector to that level is a major undertaking. So that includes, and before I entered this room, I had a discussion already in the holding room about carving out a particular sector or make the standards easier to adapt for small, medium-sized enterprises. And that is, I think, if you would achieve that in Indonesia, a big part of our challenge, our homework would be actually achieved to transform the country. So transforming Indonesia includes particularly the small, medium-sized enterprises. And that is actually the weakness, the digital literacy. I mentioned another one that is maybe not that obvious, but it is something, no, can I go back to the other slide, please, just very briefly? So you see in the right upper corner, or you saw, there was one sentence written, unclear digital leadership. What does it really mean? Well, we have too many, in my view, too many government entities talking about digital matters. We have a ministry responsible for e-government, another one is a ministry for communication and informatics. They are sometimes saying they are responsible for the infrastructure, but when it comes to e-government, that's not them, etc. And so it's hard sometimes to get everybody on board. And what we wish, or what I wish as a chief executive of OneTechNAS or the National ICT Council, that we have something like a chief digital officer. That would make the transformation easier. And I've seen, we've made some benchmarks with other countries. Sometimes that kind of a person is a minister, it could be a head of a non-ministerial government agency, or even in the office of the president. All of the above is available in other countries as an example. And it's not, neither one is better or worse than the other, but you just have to appoint a person that is responsible overall. And then it's much easier to decide on things, and that would also make digital transformation easier. So you need a very clear change agent, somebody who is responsible top-down and really resolve issues and resolve conflicts or potential conflicts between various entities. That is very, very important. And the threat is also important here, and I think if you read the media recently, there's more and more focus now coming back to digital divide issues. Because if you imagine that certain parts of our population for either knowledge or economic reasons don't have the same access than other parts of digital technology, the ones that have access and can really use it, they can accelerate their development. And so they will be even faster ahead, more ahead than the others that are left behind. So the digital divide would then actually translate immediately into a larger socioeconomic gap, and that is, I think, something very challenging, very dangerous. So now the next slide, please. So this is a more academic slide according to this institution. The pandemic response has been basically like this. You see something immediate, something more like slower, and something long-term. And the renewal is basically something, I think that the transformation is basically a renewal. And so that is something that the very nature of things will need more time because it's so substantial. So the next slide shows you basically what the post-pandemic shifts really look like. So we have here these 4 categories: customers and challenges, value chains and operations, work and workforce, and lastly, technology and infrastructure. So if I may focus on the technology infrastructure side, what we see right now is basically all goes to cloud. Yeah. Basically, it enables also concepts like as a service. You have basically software as a service. It could be anything. I mean, like financial service as a service, or everything. The commercial model is more by the click rather than you buy a big piece of software that is installed in your computer, but you can access it and you have to pay for it, but very small micropayments whenever you use it. That is more and more transforming actually our digital landscape. Also, the integration of physical and digital assets, that's something which is happening right now. Mr. Opperman mentioned the dominance of the big data companies. Data is the new oil. You mentioned it as well. This is, I think, so-called digital assets are now perceived as, and there are real assets that probably at some point will be noted as such on balance sheets, right? But we haven't really seen that yet. But I think, and the last one is basically the integration of AI or artificial intelligence. So that is something which is very transformative when it comes to anything regarding technology infrastructure in the context of business and operating model shifts. So now to the core. I mean, what about standardization? So the standardization, in my view, is very, very important. Of course, it's pivotal when you talk about shaping digital transformation. It can be seen as a facilitator or as an accelerator. So standards play a very big role in basically supporting digital transformation, particularly after the pandemics. And on the right-hand side of the slide, the pie chart, you see various categories where the standards in digital transformation play a big role. There's something like, I mean, we are all familiar with those, climate action, or you see this is basically SDGs, right? We have the SDGs grouped here in the pie chart manner around the keyword standards and digital transformation. And for all of those SDGs, standards and digital transformation plays a very central role. Next slide, please. So the aspects considered in developing standards are basically, you have to have a strategy, a very robust one. Then collaboration, also mentioned by Mr. Opperman, is very important. Worldwide, because standards should be worldwide as much as we can in order to make them really useful for everybody. And it should be also cooperation not only worldwide, but also between developers of all types. And by that, we have to also make sure that sustainability is something that is, in today's world, we are so focused on things related to net zero. Of course, sustainability is core. And lastly, standardization should always be guided by the so-called 7 principles, which are trustworthiness, interoperability, safety, security, data privacy, inclusiveness, stability, sustainability, and international collaboration. And by that, we can support the 3P: people, prosperity, and our planet. So, well, as a closing, I think to just summarize, we cannot run away from digital transformation. I think it's inevitable, and I think we probably all agree on that. And at the same time, it really has shown us how we can basically solve many problems when we were still in the pandemic area, and right now I see a mix between people that wear masks and not, so we are probably transitioning out. We're not fully out, but I think most of us have already either experienced it themselves or are fully vaccinated or both. And so the effect of the pandemic is already basically, I wouldn't say over, but we are at the very, very last part. And the readiness of human resource, as already mentioned many times by myself, is key to all of the above. Standards have a prime role to facilitate and accelerate, and collaboration, particularly when it comes to technical cooperation between stakeholders, is something which is very, very important in the context. I think that's it from my side. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Beebe. I'd like to now welcome our second panellist up onto the stage, please. Vitasari Anyareni, who's the Deputy Director of Policy, Southeast Asia Women's World Banking. Please join me in welcoming Vitasari. And since you now have the microphone, if you'd like to offer your opening remarks, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Ian. Good morning, distinguished delegates and guests, and distinguished panelists. It's an honor to be here with you. And thank you for the organizer to invite Women's World Banking in this opportunity. It is a privilege for me to be here representing Women's World Banking. So maybe for some of you who are not familiar with Women's World Banking, we are a global NGO. We've established in 1970s, and for more than 40 years, we work to advance women's financial inclusion, which also includes digital financial inclusion. So we work directly with the financial institution across the globe in 35 countries to design products that tap into women's market. We also work with the policymakers across our priority market to design gender lens policy to advance women's financial inclusion. And we also conducting a leadership and diversity training for the leaders in the financial institutions and regulators. So maybe if we can go like a short introduction on the topic that we will discuss here, and in the context of women's digital financial inclusion, in the context of digital transformation. I will start with a question, maybe the next slide. Yeah. So why does financial inclusion matter? In Women's World Banking, we define financial inclusion as having the choice to access financial solutions under her own name, and also capability to make financial decisions towards different life cycle throughout the lives of a women and men. But why does it matter? Because when women have access to financial inclusion, it improves the lives of women and the lives of those around, while strengthening communities, but also adding opportunities to financial institutions and contribute to the national economies. Next slide, please. Yeah. So when women have access to financial services, which also include digital financial services, not only that women will benefit herself, but also will contribute to the basic investment in health and basic education and in the family. Next. Communities will improve the standard of living. With the many families increase their standard of living, then the numbers of girls participating in secondary education will also increase. And for each additional year of secondary education will lead to 25% increase in the potential earning. Financial institution will gain an untapped commercial opportunity. It is estimated that around $700 billion in additional revenue can be gained by giving equal opportunity for women to access financial inclusion. And the last, eventually the global economy thrive. Next, I think there's, okay. So with women having access to financial inclusion, it can add as much as $28 trillion to global GDP by 2025. And in the context of SDGs, financial inclusion is put as an enabler to push towards achieving SDG goals. But despite all this evidence and all these potentials, next slide please, there are still systemic gaps and discriminatory practice that limits women's participation in social, economy, and financial inclusion. There are so many numbers, impactful numbers here, but I think some of the key things that I would like to highlight here that relevant to our discussion would be that overall it will take around 136 years to close the gender gap worldwide. That's if we keep doing the business as usual without having a women perspective or gender lens perspective. The smartphone ownership gap is at 18%. It could be a small number, but what's discouraging is that this number is only increasing in the past year. even with the pandemic. So with the pandemic access push towards digitalization, digital transformation, but it doesn't address the gender gap. 44% women doesn't have digital ID gap, doesn't have digital ID as compared to men with 28%. Women and girls undertake 3 times unpaid care work compared to men, and it represents a $10.8 trillion contribution to the global economy. I think as we can see from these overall numbers here, that around 190 countries, there are still some economies that limit mobility of women, limit the asset ownership, and also only some mandate equal pay for equal work. So I think I will stop my presentation here as an introduction, and we can discuss in this. Thank you, Ian.
Thank you very much. And could I now invite our last in-person panelist, Val Diab, who is the chair of ISO IEC JTC1 Subcommittee 42, the subcommittee that's working on artificial intelligence. Val, would you please join us on stage?
Thank you, Ian. I'm actually virtual today, not on stage. But happy, but to your point, I mean, we're lucky that we can do this. I wanted to first thank ISO, IEC, ITU, the World Trade Organization, BSN, and of course the G20 for the opportunity to talk about our work. I chair, as Ian mentioned, the International Standards Committee that's joint between ISO and IEC on artificial intelligence. We're scoped to be the focal point for the JTC1 IT program on AI between ISO and IEC, but we also provide guidance in terms of enabling other IEC, ISO, and JTC1 committees to develop AI applications. We have 50 countries that participate. BSN is one of our observing members. We also have over 50 liaisons, internal and external. 250 delegates typically plus attend our sessions with 30 active projects and about 15 published. We also directly support 12 of the 17 UN SDGs and indirectly support all of them through the application of our standards in vertical domains. I did want to share a couple of slides just to give you a little bit more background in terms of what we do. And if I could just quickly confirm that you can see my slides.
Yes.
Perfect, thank you. So we have an approach to look at the entire AI ecosystem, and to one of the points on the previous discussion, that also includes the development of standards that support third-party certification and audit, which is an increasingly important thing. But one thing here that is a little interesting that I believe some of my colleagues on the panel are touched on is the fact that the world is changing. So technology is not only just for technologists, and the way we are developing standards has evolved to address that as well. So at the top of my chart, you can see what I call non-technical trends and requirements. So on the extreme right, we have business problems that we try to solve. And on the extreme left, we look at application domain requirements because we don't want to develop a standard from an IT perspective that's just used in one domain. But what's interesting is we're also looking at emerging societal requirements, things like ethics, data, and so on, as well as regulatory and policy requirements. And we're doing these upfront and concurrently with the development of the technical part of the standards. We look at all of this and then look at what I call the context of use of the technology, which in our case is artificial intelligence, big data, and their application to analytics. We then develop a package of horizontal standards, things like foundational concepts, reference architectures, use cases, and management system standards as an example. But the story does not end there. In the standards world, we work with our sister committees in IEC and ISO to develop domain-specific standards that build on these. Open source communities can use this, as well as proprietary implementations. So this is a novel approach to try and look at the whole ecosystem in partnership with other committees and organizations. I also wanted to talk about a comment that Ian made, which is the idea of using technology and the tools available to us. So you may not speak standardese or attend standards meeting for a daytime job, But thanks to all the technology, there are a couple of opportunities for you to join and learn more about what's happening. The first is a conference that IEC puts on called AI with Trust. It's based in Geneva, run in a hybrid fashion in conjunction with the Swiss Federal Department on Foreign Affairs, and has a multi-stakeholder approach. The second is an ISO IEC workshop that we do twice a year, which SC42 facilitates and organizes, and explores everything from the application of AI standards, novel AI standardization approaches, beneficial AI, enabling technology trends and AI requirements. Again, multi-stakeholder, multidisciplinary approach that brings together people from, really top people who AI is top of mind, but may come from different perspectives. Here's the information. We'll make this available. We have the upcoming one is at the end of November. You can find the previous information and all the presentations from the last workshop, as well as registering for the new one. And I'm not going to go into the details, but you can see that we've got 4 tracks set up. The first one will be on AI applications, talking about healthcare, looking at beneficial AI, novel standardization approaches, and then finally, emerging AI technology trends and requirements. So with that, thank you very much, and I look forward to the panel discussion.
Thank you very much, Vail. Please join me in thanking Vail. And our last panelist today, who I believe is joining us virtually, is Armin Oyujan, who is the founding CEO at Foundation for Armenian Science and Technology, joining us virtually. Wonderful. Please, Armin, your opening statement.
Okay, good. Hey, I don't know whether it's very late at night where I am, so I don't know what time you have there, but good day, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, organizers, for making this happen. I think this is an important discussion, especially right around the corner when G20 is going to meet. I appreciate the contributions of our panelists. It's a privilege to be with you on this panel. I suppose one aspect of this is how do we really benefit from this digital transformation? And look, all of our panelists and colleagues provided very interesting work that they're doing and important figures and studies and assessments they have done that will help their own organizations, but also through the experiences and expertise of their own organizations for us to be moving forward. In the work that we're doing, I represent the Foundation for Armenian Science and Technology. We look at what type of an ecosystem can we build that will enable scientific advancement and technological innovation, and what is the essence of technology, and what is the requirement for technology to help transform the human and humanity in itself. We like to look at technology as a liberator. If I were to compare it to possibly Greek gods, it would be the Nike, or if Roman gods, it would be Mercury. It is people's wings in a way, right? Provides access to information to a greater population, which until just recent past, and more so actually with COVID, it really helped us to connect better. By that, adding more general intellectual capacity to everyone by bringing people close to one another, thereby enhancing more synaptic connections. So you think of every individual being a neuron, and then you're connecting this neurons through synaptic connections, and that would be, in today's world, that would be the technology. It helps us expand markets. Think of how without technological advancements, they would not have been Amazon or Walmart's growth year after year would not have been possible if you didn't have these types of technological advancements. The biggest hurdles, I would say, is to be found in education. Not everyone can contribute or benefit from it, especially when we're talking about education by way of national policies. Some nations get to integrate technology too late, thereby contributing to added opportunity costs or lost opportunities, or having strict policies, thereby hindering innovation, entrepreneurship, gender and minority inclusion. So we've looked into all of these, we've been looking at all of these aspects when we're looking at technology, and here's where we look at standardization, how it will become an enabler, because you know, and maybe it could be during the Q&A session, but I think it would be important to also explore how perhaps the incorrect or not well thought through standardization can hinder technological advancement. And I think here the human factor is very important. I heard my colleagues speak about ethics and anything that would be connected with human perception, which is very different in very different parts of the world, and in various ethnic groups and in gender compositions, that may set technology to go in various ways, and at times inadvertently in the wrong way. So looking at this and trying to figure out what type of or what part of technology can help the human make the proper decisions in a way. So we look at number of verticals in AI, and our colleague just spoke a lot about artificial intelligence a minute ago. We look at artificial intelligence a lot, and we know it's no longer knocking on your doors. It actually is here, you know, being used in everything from food production to automotive industry to, you know, flying planes, seeding the fields, harvesting crops, identifying diseases, finding medical solutions, even listening to the radio, types of music you like, buying cleaning goods, understanding what types of products you'll be using and have been using, getting into transportation, meeting friends, finding loved ones, you know, monitoring your children's homework. The list is immense. I mean, you can go on and on. And then, you know, the next phase of this would be possibly replacing us in the workplace. That's also in the cards. So, you know, we look at AI as solutions that don't get exhausted or take breaks, vacations, sick days, or maternity or paternity leaves. So these are all the possible benefits of this. But if, going back to what I said about education, if people aren't educated to be part of it, or if the government policies don't allow proper integration or deployment, it hinders growth and asset creation in all those areas. So when we talk about, and this is why I find these types of meetings with what ISO is doing and ITU and what have you are critical, but also critical for us to understand that human element, when humans get together to establish new policies, new regulations, the bias always exists, and we don't know about this. You know, we generally, we're not aware of the biases that we have. So at times when we bring our even well-intended intentions into new policies, we may inadvertently, just to make the final point, inadvertently create something that would be detrimental to the growth of societies, but also to the growth of which can hinder technological advancement and technological innovation. So I want to stop here. Essentially, the point was, you know, as far as deep technologies and the verticals we're looking into, and integration of AI into all aspects of technological development, when we bring in the human factor, whether we create policies or we follow policies, we just got to be extremely cautious for us not to add layers of bias without even recognizing that we are adding to them. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Arman. Please join me in thanking Arman for his opening statements. Now, we have some questions I'd like to run through, and then I'd like to save some time for audience questions. So we're going to have to be a little bit snappy with our answers, unfortunately. But Ilham, with putting you on notice to be the first respondent, how digital transformation is often described in terms of words like disruption. How can digital transformation actually promote development?
Thanks for the question. Well, first of all, I don't think that it's always disruptive. It can be actually, it depends what the digital transformation does. Let's assume you would basically deliver something to a group of people that have not had that service before. There's disruption, but it's not felt as a disruption, it's actually an immediate enhancement of their lives. I mean, talking about what Mrs. Vita was saying, when you deliver financial services to people that have not had any before, it is from the outside seen as a disruption. For them, it's an immediate enhancement of their lives. I mean, in Indonesia, there's an example. Before we had fintechs in Indonesia, there were less than 50% of our population having bank accounts. So they don't have the convenience of having a stability financial in terms of having the ability to transfer money and receiving money. So that is actually also something that addresses your point of development. What is seen from the outside as a disruption, in many cases, if you look at the world of startups, many of those basically focus on areas where you see an immediate need, which has not been fulfilled by the conventional and traditional industry. So there is a transformation happening. It is from the outside seen as some disruptive, but really it disrupts something where before there was not much. Yeah. So it is definitely a positive development in that regard. Yeah.
Great answer, really great response. And I think identifying unmet need and disrupting in that way, I think is just absolutely fantastic. Yeah. Vitasari, I'm going to turn to you. Your work brings women into the financial conversation. And I have to say that number of 135.6 years, my goodness, absolutely amazing. What's the role of digital tools in securing women's well-being as active participants in the future digital economy? And what is the role of digital tools in general for the vision that you see?
Thank you, Ian, for the question. I think aligned with what Pak Ilham also mentioned, that disruption is inevitable as well, and that I think there are, in many countries, are found that when talking about the financial inclusion, when the country has low penetration of bank account, the penetration of mobile money is even higher. So indeed, there are potential there. And out of 2/3 of women who doesn't have access to bank account do own mobile phone. So I think we all agree that there are how digital tools can be beneficial, looking at the potential. However, to ensure that this digital tool really address and really benefit the women, I think there are three points that we advocate in Women's World Banking. First is to mandate gender disaggregated data, to analyze it and to use it as policy making, as an evidence for policy making, or to design product for financial services. The second is leveraging unsecured loan and addressing the algorithmic gender bias. I think I've heard a lot also in our discussion today that we are addressing algorithmic bias, and in this context, it's also the gender bias in algorithmic. And the third, I think, align with the introduction that from Pak Ilham, that it's not only about infrastructure, but also about the people. And in Women's World Banking, we advocate for digital financial capability. And the word capability is intentional because it is more than digital literacy or financial literacy, but it is beyond after women have the knowledge, they will also then possess the skill and to be capable to use the digital and financial tools as in their financial decision. So there is an element of behavior change to really ensure that the digital tools can benefit women. I hope that answered.
Fantastic, thank you very much. For those who've ever looked at the UN Sustainable Development Goals, there is a website you can go to which looks at impact pathways and specifically looking at the impact of financial tools on the different Sustainable Development Goals. I thoroughly recommend that to you. Armin, I'm going to throw to you. In your opening remarks, you talked about some of the implications of use of AI. You talked about the need for ethical frameworks. You talked about the unintended consequences. Can you just give us a little more about the challenges of integration of AI in industries and other sectors? What should we be watching out for?
You know, some of I think our panelists, thanks for the question. Some of our panelists talked about data. Data is a critical component here. I think standardization is vital here for technological progress. I would, more data, homogeneous data, sorted data, protected data, available data. All of this helps tech development. What we're doing, for instance, in Armenia with the government of Armenia, trying to figure out how best can we extract homogeneous data, which is far better than heterogeneous data for specific solutions that you would look at. But how can you extract it, and how can you maintain it and monetize it, and then make it available for purposes of research or integration in various private sector initiatives. Not everyone is going to have access to data. And if you don't have access to data and you go for application or implementation, you may actually get consequences and you may get responses and answers that could be detrimental for the business. It would be without proper data assortment, it would be like blind leading the blind. You would come up with responses from your marketing teams, for instance, driving types of products that you had no intention of bringing to market, or sending it to various other parts of the world where you don't have business, thereby either hurting you in the short run or hurting you in the long run. So integration of some of these solutions into your business need to be very well thought through, and that's number one. Number two, also progressing. So it's just integrating a solution isn't enough. You would want to understand how you're also going to continuously be able to advance it. Many of you again mentioned that there is going to be almost like a technological explosion. Well, this technological explosion can happen if properly scientific advancement between technology happens in proper manner, and people that really understand how to deal with data are the ones who are driving these type of technological advancements in the first place. I would say, overall integration of artificial intelligence in all the verticals, anything from agri-tech to fintech to ed-tech, even fashion tech, are positive as long as the AI, the artificial intelligence technology itself is properly understood and the data that is supporting is properly collected and properly maintained and properly made available for both engineers and the consequence of that to the public.
Thank you, Armin. Vail, next question to you. And the work you're leading with SC42 is, of course, very important. Personally believe it's a really critical area to make sure that we're deploying safe AI. But given the pace of technological change, given the scale of the challenge that we're talking about to meet some of these big challenges, how can standards enable innovation?
Thank you, Ian. That's a good question. And you don't often hear standards and innovation in the same sentence, although I think we should talk more about it. I'm going to use the work of SC42 to give 4 brief examples of how that actually happens. The first is we have quite novel approaches to deal with AI-specific issues. So by and large, AI is an IT technology and shares a lot with traditional systems, but there are aspects, like my colleagues have pointed out, to, for instance, the learning aspect, data bias, and so on. So for those of you familiar with standards like ISO 9001, ISO IEC 27001, which are called management system standards, we are taking a similar approach for AI with 42001, where we tie everything together and basically enable third-party audit, as well as increasing consumer confidence in the use of AI. So this is a very novel and innovative approach to solve a problem that's emerging and unique. And the management system standards is just one example. We have a whole number that we're dealing with. The second example I want to talk about is when we partner with application domain standards to enable new areas. So I think there's been a number that have been mentioned by my colleagues on the panel, so I'm not going to go through them, but from fintech to transportation to healthcare. So this, again, now we are able to take it to the next level. I believe one aspect that was brought up in a previous workshop was this idea of assisted active living and how AI is transforming that vertical by enabling things that would otherwise not be possible. The third is something that, for those of us that develop products and services, understand that as these systems get more and more complex, you have a limited set of resources to be able to work on a particular product. So we often use the term of being able to innovate on top of standards. So in our case, the standards can be used as a base that allows for industry to then take advantage of that and be able to innovate on top of it. Last but not least, like the first 2 speakers mentioned, when we think of, the labor force and we think of a particular region or country or globally, this is all about people. I have a 6-year-old and I'm constantly amazed at how much better he is at doing basic things that I was a lot older when I was learning, whether it's math or it's language. So by providing technology like AI through broad responsible adoption, we are also allowing for our future citizens to grow up and be more productive. So I believe that in turn has a knock-on effect on innovation. The more access is provided, the better it is. And of course, we partner with all sorts of organizations. One example is we work with the expert group on UNESCO for looking at adoption of AI. Thank you.
Thanks, Vail. Now, we are running a little late, so we're going to need to tighten up our responses and compress a few of the questions. And I've just received some questions from the audience, which I'm keen to get through. So, Vitasari, I'm going to ask you, the scale of the problem we've said is large. The challenge for all of us, the entire human race, is substantial. With that as context, why is it important to apply a gender lens when designing a digital transformation policy?
Thanks, Ian. I think the why will already been answered slightly in the previous presentation. However, it is very important also to stress that when we are designing policy, designing a product, including designing a digital transformation, without having a gender lens, then we're only designing for half of the population, which is men. But usually, if we use the gender lens, then we use a women-centered design, that's what we call it in women's world banking, is that we're actually addressing the need and we're designing for both men and women. Why? Because usually in our norms, women tend to have more barriers. So for example, when a fintech, for example, designing a financial solution that address the limitation of women that have to work at home, but also have to, so she doesn't have so much time to commute to go to the bank. So this solution that created by fintech can be applied to women, but also it simplifies the process for men. So having that women perspective when designing is important. And how to do that is to increase number of women when we're designing product or our solution or our policy, and also increasing the numbers of women in the decision maker so that the policy or the end product that are rolled out is having that perspective of women and addressing that this there are different barriers, there are different needs between men and women that needs to be addressed in order to achieve like the full potential of digital transformation.
Great. Following on from that, Ilham, question for you. In a country as populous as Indonesia, 275 million people, how do we ensure that everyone has access to tools provided by digital transformation, and how do we ensure that the majority of the population benefits from digital transformation?
Thanks for the question. First of all, if you talk about reaching everybody, there's a few aspects to answer this question. First of all, you'd have to talk about access, right? So access means, basically that goes to infrastructure, right? So we have to make sure Indonesia is not only a lot of people, it's a big country with very different and complex islands that are very different from one another, and the status of the infrastructure in those very islands is very different from island to island, actually. So there are Java is a small island and it's rather developed regarding its infrastructure. Papua is a very large island and we have half of that. And it's very difficult to even connect people from a technological standpoint of view because it's so complex. I mean, there's large jungles and high mountains and deep valleys, etc. So it's really complex. So infrastructure is one important aspect to look at, and Indonesia has been very good, I think, in delivering infrastructure to the we call it the last mile, right? The last mile. Sorry, the first mile. So basically, the backbone is there, which we call, there's a backbone consisting out of fiber optics, but where we struggle, and that is the last mile, basically delivering connectivity to the homes, to the individuals, to the offices, to the schools, hospitals, universities, et cetera, et cetera. And that, in the end, is not only a matter of technology, but it's a matter of affordability. So digital technology is still at a price point for many in Indonesia that is difficult, right? That's to say the least. And in the pandemic, you have seen that the government had to basically give something like a digital, call it a subsidy, to the households, particularly when it comes to learning. Most, if not all, schools were closed at some point in time, and then we really could see that there was gaps in the population. It's not only about knowing how to use it, but actually afford it. Yeah, so, and even if you can afford it, the quality of the connectivity varies, right? If you're in a city like Jakarta, it's very high speed and quite consistent. If you're somewhat in the outback, as we say in Indonesia as well, then it's hard, right? It's not only expensive, but it's also spotty. So connectivity is one thing. Then the other thing, of course, goes back to digital literacy. So and digital literacy is also something that varies from region to region. Actually, social strata-wise, if you are a professional working at a company that uses digital technology on a day-to-day basis, you're quite familiar with the tools. If you're a farmer or a fisherman, then you're probably not that familiar, if at all. And so there needs to be a lot of attention to making digital literacy basically more evenly spread among Indonesians. And how to measure that, I think some of the things I showed in my presentation. You see that at the UNDP Human Development Index, and that is measured actually throughout the country. And in today's world, I would even go as far, if you talk about human rights, in my view, connectivity, digital connectivity should be a human right. So by that, basically, you can make sure that, because it's not just a new technology, I would describe it as a meta technology. So many benefits you get are better and faster and cheaper delivered using digital technology, and actually potentially also better spread out in your population. But potentially. There's still a challenge to be met infrastructure-wise, affordability, so the cost point, it needs to be clear. There are areas where you can have private companies basically offer the service, people can really afford it, and the cost is low because there's also a lot of people living in the country in that particular part. Others are not feasible commercially, so the government has to subsidize the delivery of the service there in a way in order to make sure that all the citizens get the same quality of service.
Thank you very much. That's a very comprehensive answer. And I think your comment about connectivity as a human right is a really interesting point.
Yeah.
Declaration of Human Rights is now almost 70 years old.
Yeah.
And the question is, if we framed it today, would it look like it did 70 years ago? Val, I'm going to cheat a little bit and combine 3 questions for you. So if you could give a short but very comprehensive answer to these 3 questions. The question is about data and digital standards and making the world a better, more inclusive, fairer place. There is a subsequent question from Ferdy Beer, who has highlighted the 3 laws of robotics. The first law, robot may not injure a human. Second law, a robot must obey the orders given by humans. Third law, a robot must protect its own existence as long as it does not violate the first 2 laws. Given that you're working in AI and robots are autonomous, artificially intelligent devices, and given the rest of the context, how is the work that you're doing in standards, in data and digital, and specifically AI, leading to a better, fairer world?
Yeah, thank you. So I will try to be brief and combine all 3 questions. Let me start with the first piece, which is how to leverage standards to build a fairer or more equal world. I think one component of this is who works on these standards. And one of the key differences that we're seeing is a huge amount of diversity in terms of who's showing up, right? First of all, it's not just the engineers or the marketeers behind the technology or the data scientists. It's also policymakers, it's ethicists, it's academics, it's economists. So, that makes a huge difference on the quality of the standards that come out. 2, we are an international standards committee, so we have representation from 50 countries that include delegates that are not just developing, but also using the standard. I think that makes a tremendous amount of difference. As my previous colleagues described, we need to have broad responsible adoption from the beginning. So that means dealing right up front with things like bias, ethics. So we have an entire program of work looking at how to deal with that. We have an entire group looking at just trustworthiness, right? So this shows you how it's different. And finally, partnering with other organizations as we develop this. In terms of data, I think the question about data is really interesting because as we've seen IT kind of move along, we've done a lot of innovation and connectivity, and we continue to compute, right? Today, I believe it's looking at data is important, but what does that actually mean? We hear people say like data is the new oil. Well, what are we doing in the standards world? I believe the key is coming up with deeper insights. As one of my colleagues said, how can you get more efficiency out of your production, or how can you get more meaningful information? And in order to do that, then we need to also make sure that when we look at all of this data, it's beneficial without the downside. So one key thing that we're using standards for is we're looking at properties of data. Whether it's big data and we look at, how you design compute systems to deal with that, or it's for AI where you're training an algorithm, the properties of the data are very key. So one series of standards that we're developing is on quality for AI and analytics using machine learning. Finally, I think when it comes to this data piece, it's important to look at the full ecosystem. So it's not just on the AI processing part, but as you kind of go across the different application domains, you're finding more and more people are looking at data and how it's being used. So the idea of data governance or helping provide guidance as to how these systems can be used is key. So personally, I think that's one of the most innovative areas and areas that standards can make a huge amount of difference. In terms of the last point, I think this is a really interesting point. And, I would note that most AI systems are not fully autonomous. I think it's great to use the robot example to illustrate the point, but it is a combination of all of the standards that we would build that would provide things. For example, learning is a little bit different than traditional IT systems, but we can use techniques that exist, like risk assessment or building a risk framework. Then in partnership with the vertical domains that deploy these systems, they can take our base horizontal standards, develop vertical standards that allow them to meet their environment. And of course, this is not a dialogue in vacuum. They would be working with regulators in their area. They'd be working with users in their area. So it's not a single silver bullet. It's more I guess maybe my takeaway message, it's the philosophy that the way we are developing standards now is very different than how we did it 30 years ago. We are taking these concerns, which is real concerns, privacy, trustworthiness, aspects of data, and addressing them upfront so that we can get the benefit of broad adoption, but do it responsibly. Thank you.
Thanks, Vail. We're in our last minute, and I'm really keen to hear just one last thing from our panelists. Armin, if you're still there, I'd like to know very, very quickly the most important question or the most important issue that we should be thinking about as we move into this digitally transformed world. And if you could be really precise, please.
Right. I think I would tie it to your previous question with Asimov's 3 laws for robots. And it's quite interesting, but I think it's also 50 years old. And, the processes and the world has gone beyond that. I can understand why when we're talking about technology, we want to be protective of us. And I think the world is split into two camps. One that says we need to be very careful how technology advances. The other camp, we need to let technology develop itself. I would want to look at this very, very briefly. I understand we're under time duress. I would ask for us to look at this from the biological level of extrapolation. For us to think that we are going to control technology, for us to think that we are essentially gods of technology is a bit arrogant. Because if you look at the evolution where we are and where life has been, we've been around for around only 300,000 years, whereas the life on this planet has been around for 4 billion years. For us to think that in this small amount of time, somehow we're the end of the evolutionary chain, therefore, creation that we have in this case, technology, belongs to us, and then we're going to apply the 3 laws that Asimov speaks in his book about controlling robots or controlling artificial intelligence. I think it's a bit precarious. I think we need to look beyond that. What if technology, and the purpose of technology is to help us, for us to move forward and beyond the limitations that we have as human species? In order to do that, we cannot ourselves be able to control something that's going to help us to move forward. Just one last statement. There's a very prominent scientist and writer, Max Tegmark, is the book. He has written, I think it's called Life 3.0. In there, he says, imagine if the whole world was 5-year-old kids, and you were the only adult left on the planet. And then you're trying to help these 5-year-old kids, for them to grow, for them to prosper. But because they're 5-year-old, they're looking at you and you're massively different than anything that they have seen. So they tie you down. They're trying to control you. The question is, you as an adult have very limited ways to explain to these 5-year-olds, look, whatever it is that I'm trying to do for the benefit of you. And no matter how these 5-year-olds are going to try to tie you down, at some point, you're going to find a way to free yourself. So the question is, us being the 5-year-olds, if, once the technology progresses to a limit, and then we're trying to control it, question how long we're going to try to control it or whether we should. And if we look at the trajectory of our of human evolution, in our domain as humans, I think we need to feed the technology, and I think here what our colleague Weil was mentioning, what needs to be done in terms of data and data structuring, computing becomes essential. So for transformative technology, I think we need to look at it slightly differently, not as an enemy, not someone or something that's going to come to destroy, but something and someone that we can actually collaborate with and partner with.
And I'm sorry, we're getting the wind up. We're actually a few minutes over. Vitasari and Ilman, could I just get really short, sharp, punchy, most important issue, most important question?
Sure, thanks Ian. I think from my side it's that applying gender lens in designing digital transformation is a must. Not only that it is the right thing to do, but it is a smart thing to do because it's cost efficient and it also realizes the full potential of digital transformation. And standard, innovation and inclusion must go hand in hand.
Wonderful, thank you. Ilham, last word to you.
Yeah, thanks. I think one thing that came into my mind is basically that if you think about digital transformation, of course, one has innovation in our mind. At the same time, if you think about innovation, some of us think, and I think it's true, that innovation is also thinking outside the box. Meaning, if we think about standards is actually defining the box. So what do we do? So basically, we have to realize that standards is also developing. Right? So standards need to be adjusting and basically accompanying and, in fact, sometimes helping innovation in order to get where we want to go.
Great, fantastic. Please join me in thanking our panel.
Ladies and gentlemen, once again, please give a big round of applause to our keynote speaker, Ian Opperman, and also our panelists of speakers with the second session, Accelerating Digital Transformation at the G20 International Standards Summit 2022.